Buenos días a todos y todas. Bienvenidos a esta mesa que va a considerar los aportes de la sociedad civil en función del aumento y la obtención de mayor transparencia en las plataformas digitales.
Civil society organizations to the advancement of transparency in digital platforms. We would like to implement the development of the Information and Democracy Forum regarding its report dated November 2020. In the several chapters of this work, one of them is devoted to the transparency of platforms with the intention of achieving one of the pillars of the Windhoek Declaration plus 30 that emphasizes the situation of the great Internet platforms and intends to organize campaigns from civil society. There are 47 organizations which have already adhered to this Pact for Information and Democracy, and 24 states. I'd like to use this opportunity to invite our panelists, to inform our panelists that the President of Uruguay has been invited to join this pact for information and democracy. We apologize for the technical delays, and we're going to give the floor to our panel members. With us are Olívia Bandeira, who's a journalist from Brazil. She has a PhD in anthropology, and she's a member of a collective organization that works with the rights of freedom of expression. Nighat is a lawyer in Pakistan, and she's the director of the organization Digital Rights. Virgilio Almeida is an emeritus professor of the University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. He's an associate professor at the Berman Clate and part of Internet Harvard University. Thank you for being here with us. And Marina Pita is an associate researcher of the Liberties Foundation that develops the program OBSERVACOM, which is well known. She is an expert in misinformation and the transparency of platforms. Thank you for being here. I would like you to use your initial 5 minutes to then proceed to a round of questions. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the forum and say hello to all the participants. Thank you, Damián, for your introduction. I work at Intervozes in Brazil. It's a collective of activists, journalists, researchers that has been active for almost 20 years, struggling for communication as a human right, and recognized by the McBride Forum that UNESCO promoted in the 80s. As of last year, we are part of the Forum for Information and Democracy, and for that, I would like to we use a Latin American perspective to face all these subjects. For the time being, I would like to speak of this research, and I would like to hail a document published by the Forum, which is a very good piece of work that takes into account works carried out by many platforms across the world, and that are part of the debate that is being carried out in our region. Last year, we published the study Speaking News, which was on the policies of combat of information adopted by the main platforms that operate in Brazil: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, and Twitter. The measures adopted in 2018 were analyzed when the phenomenon was considered a problem at the world level, in Brazil in particular, until the measures adopted in 2020, imposing changes justified by the pandemic. The research reinforces the point 1.4, finish with the infodemic, which is finishing with the algorithms, and among other things, it recommends the adoption of protocols arising from what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The research carried out by Intervozes confirms this. I would like to point out some questions regarding transparency demonstrated by a paper regarding transparency. First, the companies don't have structured policies to combat disinformation. The measures are not organized, with the exception of YouTube, which launched a disinformation filter in October 2020. The absence of policies makes research difficult. A group of researchers attempted to organize the information that is dispersed throughout official websites, in assistance websites, and the companies themselves. It's a very opaque process for researchers, and it's more opaque still for users of the platform. The document ending the infodemic makes good points in different chapters. I believe that this is an important counterpoint to the fact that they cannot provide certain types of information based on arguments of intellectual property, as they are doing in Brazil. As I pointed out in yesterday's panel on transparency, I believe that transparency and accountability are obligations, are mandatory for the platforms, because they are services of public interest. This cannot be treated as a cost, because these private interests cannot be more important than guaranteeing the right of users, and also public oversight, which can be exercised by means of the information provided to users, researchers, and regulating organisms. The study of Intervozes emphasizes transparency in terms of information, fake news, or misinformation. There is no transparency on what kind of content can be affected by the analysis made by the platforms. And a big problem is the lack of balance between the information in respect of the measures adopted. There is very scant information, unlike Europe. In Brazil, it was impossible to detect any document that indicated the effectiveness of the adopted measures. The reports of the Center of Information in Transparency of Facebook and Twitter, for example, the term disinformation was not included in the researched period, so there is no transparency as relates to the measures adopted and the impact of the measures. I would like to point out those points. I spoke about certain points that regarded transparency, but the full battery of points is in the Intervozes website. It's in English and in Spanish. And for the time being, that's all. Thank you very much. Nighat, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here in the panel. I would quickly go to the subject and would like to talk a bit about the recommendation that the forum has mentioned in our report back in 2020. The report of the working group compiled 250 recommendations with the first chapter dedicated to platforms transparency. And as it has already been mentioned, that these recommendations provide means to legally enforce transparency of digital platforms in line with the declaration of Windhoek Plus 30 principles. Some of the principles that have been mentioned in the report is access to the qualitative and quantitative data of the leading digital platforms, and access to their algorithms is a prerequisite for evaluating them. Transparency requirements must therefore be imposed on such platforms in order to be able to determine whether they are respecting their responsibilities in these areas and in general with regard to their business models and algorithmic choices. And while saying this, we also at the forum do understand that legally enforced transparency is not a silver bullet that will fix all the issues, but it's a necessary condition to develop a more balanced equilibrium of power between the private platforms and democratic societies. And probably the first step in enabling online service providers to face problems and weaknesses they can no longer hide. At the same time, someone who is a digital rights activist in a country like Pakistan, and looking at the condition of the global South, I would also like to add here that while we talk about regulations, and which we have mentioned in our report as well, in our recommendations, it's also important to keep in mind when we talk about regulations, the regulations that are enacted in the global north, in EU, in US, sometimes set a precedent for the countries where the rule of law is not really that strong, where the oppressive regimes might copy paste the same laws and sort of use to oppress the vulnerable communities or the media organizations or the journalists. And this is what we have seen in the past as well, while using the same model of the regulations and adopting here in this part of the region, and then weaponizing them against journalists, against activists, against women, against human rights defenders. So it's very important to keep that in mind while looking at the recommendation around regulation. And when we are talking about regulation, it should take into account the diversity of the platforms. At least initially concentrate on those with the most influence over our societies, according to the number of users, according to the size, the scale of market. And I think that this is where the failure to provide appropriate content moderation and the corresponding failure to adequate protect freedom of expression create the greatest harm. And just last few points for my 5 minutes. Transparency requirements should include the fields in the parameter, how the platforms implement and follow their own content moderation policies, how the algorithms operate and with objectives, what content reached the highest number of users per day per country, what advertisements are, how user data is used and to allow user to obtain information pertaining to them, what human rights impact assessment of their policies and products should include. And I think these are some of the things that have been mentioned in our report with regards to the transparency of these platforms. This is not only something that is mentioned in our report. This is also, I'm part of the oversight board, and we have also given same recommendations in some of our case decisions in the past as well. So I'll end here and would love to take this conversation forward in rest of our session.
Thank you very much. Virgilio, you have the floor. A palestra sua.
Thank you for inviting me to participate of this roundtable, and good afternoon and boa tarde. Good afternoon to everyone that is participating or attending this meeting. Well, I'm going to talk about a little bit different perspective on transparency. First, let me explain my position regarding the civil society. I was the chair of the Internet Steering Committee in Brazil from 2011 to 2015, where the Marco Civil, which the Bill of Rights was approved by Congress. And in these 5 years that I chaired the committee, civil society was, in my view, the most important stakeholder in providing good suggestions for Internet governance. And so I think that this forum is quite important because we need to have civil society involved in this question of transparency. Let me put the context for transparency. We are talking about digital platforms that are very large and complex social technical systems in which social actors and technological artifacts become intertwined. The revelations by the recent revelations of the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, and also the revelations about Cambridge Analytica, demonstrate how little society knows about what is happening inside these companies that own the big global platforms. In my view, researcher access is an important component of a larger transparency agenda. And transparency should not be, should be considered in the context of a larger governance framework. This is one of the issues of governance. When we talk about governance, digital governance needs multidisciplinary approach that bring together computer science, law, economics, political science, social science, and environment. And my point is that it is important to give researchers, computer science researchers, access to this to data of those big platforms. And I'm going to give some examples. But before I talk about this, it's important also to mention that the way that content moderation is done in the global north is different from the way that content moderation is done in the global south. I think that there are different standards as to what kind of moderation policies the companies enforce, and how concerned they are about the misuse of their tools, depending on the importance of the country. So content moderation in the US is different from content moderation in Asia or in Latin America. So that's another point that we should consider in this context. Recently, there were some articles, published in the scientific literature, arguing that it is important to have access to those platforms, because in that case, computer science is the area that can understand what is going on. because based on data, we can provide evidence that the platforms are doing something that society does not agree, depending on the country. So I think that, well, in my view, one important suggestion is, first, to have a multidisciplinary teams working to understand what those opaque platforms are doing. And computing research can be viewed as a detector of social issues. Computing can be used to diagnose, to provide diagnostic of what's going on in the platforms, and also as they can be used, computing research can be used as a rebuttal to what is informed to society. So my point here is that in order to create solid mechanisms for transparency, it is important to provide researchers from different fields access to data of those transparency. In Brazil, there is a bill being discussed in Congress. It's called the Bill of Transparency of Social Media and Search Engine Tools. And this bill has an article that indicates the importance of providing researchers access to data and to data of those platforms. Of course, this access should be controlled by several protocols that keep privacy of the users. So my point is that in order to have to understand what is going on inside the big platforms, we need independent research to increase transparency. So that's my suggestion for this meeting here. Thank you.
Thank you, Virgilio. Marina, por favor.
Gracias por la invitación. Yo voy a hablar desde como pesquisadora asociada de OBSERVACOM.
Thank you for the invitation. I will be talking about from my OBSERVACOM perspective. We researched the position of the civil society on platform transparency. From that research, I can share with you that we have a vision of the importance of the work of the Infodemics Working Group and also the regulation proposal they developed. This paper is available. It was developed with the support of UNESCO. The civil society expresses its support for transparency mechanisms. That's the first thing. Other organizations support transparency obligations. But these general declarations are reactions to poor bills of law. So when we work with information democracy and a foreign proposal, all this is very important because it's taken a step beyond. Transparency should be compulsory. This is huge progress since the Sinclair Principles. We need to decide how to do things nationally and internationally. OBSERVACOM and other regional organizations have adopted and disseminated the standards for the democratic regulations of large platforms. There is still a lot of work to do regarding transparency. There are many innovative instruments that provide us with a new debate platform. now I would like to share some of these instruments that deserve our attention. Transparency is not just for divergent information and for the exception. There should be transparency throughout the system. We should have transparent content ranking and also content forwarding. And also when it comes to the structure of the social media, how they introduce to you other people that you should meet. So this is not just content of closed accounts. We need to know the full operation of the social media. This is a major challenge because it is based on the transparency of algorithms. This poses a challenge as identified by civil society organizations when they talk about the transparency needs. For instance, instruments that protect intellectual property rights in each country and the instruments that protect individuals' data and their privacy. This paper suggests a few interesting solutions. There is another innovative argument which we should pay attention. We might actually require these mechanisms that rank content to comply with plurality standards. Many times we say we want to know how things work, but we rarely say which objectives or platforms should meet within a given structure or mechanism. Also, companies should be transparent regarding political conflicts or political interest conflicts. An example of something that happened in Brazil around the specific bill of law debate that Virgilio mentioned. The platforms used the monopoly, the public, to stand against the regulation. Another example, Uber used its platform to tell their workers, they're not considered workers by Uber, but in any case, they told them that they shouldn't be in favor of, demonstrating or mobilizing, etc. As a society, they should use these tools to defend their interests, and that's legitimate. Another topic that has been debated today is the connection between content ranking companies and the feasibility of journalism. Those content curating companies also set the rules for buying and selling advertising. They also have a monopoly over the sector, this other sector. So we think it's reasonable for them to determine how advertising is made available, sold, to whom, also the rules governing the system. And we need to decide if it's reasonable for those companies to buy journalistic companies. There is now a higher pressure regarding these companies and how they should be sustainable and promote sustainable journalism. So we need to determine the conflicts of interest that we now have and also the potential conflicts of interest. We should also consider transparency in that regard, and that's a first step. Another interesting aspect that we should address. Okay, I have 1 minute. We should also address governance proposals regarding transparency and platform regulations. In Latin America, in particular, there is a balance regarding how states work and also the need to have regional or international cooperation so that our industry, which is our fear, which is very strong in Latin America, and it's fully justified. We're afraid that the government will control the population. And this should be in turn controlled. When the states want to penalize or punish individuals, there should be a regional forum before a person or media outlet is penalized. Finally, we conducted this research in OBSERVACOM, and we aimed to implement a bill of law regarding platform regulations, and we found 18 other cases of relevant laws. We analyzed the transparency component. And actually, transparency is not a main topic within these 18 laws. This shows us that we need to work hard. We need to talk to MPs. We need to remember that transparency is the first major step, and it will help us develop information-based policies. I believe that now members of parliament do not believe in the importance of transparency of information. We need the help of civil society, and actively we need to provide information regarding what type of transparency we need. It's very important that we do that. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have had this debate, and now some questions arise from what has been discussed. I'll try to summarize them. I would like to ask you to make some brief comments. First of all, how do we actually achieve transparency regarding content moderation, as Marina was saying? This is not just about eliminating content. It's also about other processes. How are we going to achieve transparency? How do we ensure compliance with transparency standards that the civil society considers necessary? How do we create a publicly accessible database regarding transparency? And I would like you to reflect on who would have access to what. Not all users can actually fully understand the number of data available in the databases. I know that the forum's document has included a few standards in this regard. So can you please comment on this for 3 or 4 minutes? Thank you. Olívia. Question number 1. In order to achieve transparency, we need to debate what transparency is. It's what we're doing here now. We need to address standards as well. We need to work together in order to develop regulations that guarantees freedom of expression and other human rights. Also, many countries are trying to implement legislation that is out of all proportions. So I believe that our effort is very positive. The civil society is working in order to implement truly democratic regulations. And this is an effort we see in the document and in the joint work done in Latin America. For instance, we have OBSERVACOM and other regional organizations as they try to develop a Latin American agenda. In 2019, this coalition launched a document in this regard regarding digital platforms. We have also issued a declaration in November 2021 with other organizations. We talked about the importance of transparency regulations. Transparency is necessary and urgent. Also, we've had conversations throughout this conference. Yesterday, on Sunday, we had civil society organizations who made very important points in this regard and regarding this agenda. First of all, we need to define what we understand by transparency, and we need to talk about the level of transparency we'd like to achieve. And second, we should talk about governance levels that are necessary and are also possible, and they pose a huge challenge as well. I believe that the document that fights infodemics is very important. It deals with what transparency is and also governance models. Regarding transparency, Marina has shared some items I agree with. These are major topics. I would like to add one more topic that has to do with how we can empower users and researchers in order to understand transparency actions and moderation policies, but also to empower researchers and users in order to have an influence on these policies, going beyond transparency and other moderation policies that already exist. This is very important. We need to empower users and researchers so that they can also have an impact on the changes in content moderation policies. I'd like to say something else. It's also very important to guarantee, regarding transparency commitments, we need to make sure that transparency has positive effects on the public debate, on freedom of expression, and on guaranteeing the rights of users. We should assess if there is transparency, if the companies are fulfilling the criteria, and also if the impacts actually have an effect on public debate, especially regarding the groups that are affected by content moderation policies, minorities, for instance, women, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, journalists, human rights advocates. It is essential to help them so that transparency is truly effective for those social groups. Thank you very much. Thank you. Nighat, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to add what my fellow panelists already said. The focus, we cannot really achieve transparency through one measure. It's a mix of different tactics around us and multi-actors around us. And one of the solutions that have been under discussion is also self-regulatory model of these. And since I'm part of one of such models, which is Independent Oversight Board of Meta, I feel that if these self-regulatory mechanisms are truly independent, and if they have power over platform to hold them accountable around their transparency or content moderation decisions, I think this is also one way of achieving, the kind of goals that we have talked about in this session. But again, it's important to see whether these self-regulatory mechanisms are truly independent, and also whether these models are also transparent, right? So with the oversight body, not only the decisions that we release, we basically have mandatory recommendations on the platform, and so many things that we have talked about in this panel we have actually given those recommendations to Meta. And when it comes to transparency around whether those recommendations have been implemented by the platform or not, we basically released this through our own transparency report, mentioning what were our recommendations and how the platform implemented those recommendations and what recommendations they haven't implemented. So I think this is one way of looking at the self-regulatory model. This is also something that is mentioned in one way or another under Digital Services Act of EU. And I think this, when we are talking about lots of other solutions, I think this is one of the solutions that platforms can look into and civil society organizations can sort of also focus on and give their recommendations to. I mean, at least we have one independent oversight body. I hope that other companies will come up with such solutions. At the same time, I would also like to say that a lot of times we have a focus on holding tech companies and platforms accountable, and we usually do not talk about holding governments accountable, right? When they basically have so much power, and I'm talking especially about our part of the world, where these tech companies and government bodies and regulators talk behind the curtain, and they are not transparent what conversations they are having, what information they are asking, what information tech companies are giving to the governments, and it sort of endangers, the work of the media organizations, journalists, activists that I have already mentioned. And it's important that governments make these requests, content-related requests, user data requests, make them available publicly. At the same time, the tech companies also make these requests available according to the region, according to the country, in their transparency reports. So I just wanted to keep it short and very respectful to the transparency around the estates as well.
Thank you very much. Virgilio, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I have 3 quick points to talk about. The first one is that transparency is part of a larger governance framework. Should not be analyzed, separated from other characteristics of the social media platform. And governance, what we have seen is that digital governance has been led by a few developed countries and companies. And some problems of developing countries such as Brazil and Uruguay, Argentina, Pakistan are ignored, unknown, such as voice recognition, discrimination. There are many problems that should be considered as part of transparency, not only content moderation. We are talking about algorithms that give visibility to some content because of some specific characteristics, and the society needs to know not only what kind of content was blocked or removed, but why such content was accelerated, for instance, to have more visibility. I like to mention one example of our last election in Brazil in 2018. Researchers found that many messaging applications were disseminating fake pictures regarding the elections, and that was not the society was not aware of that. So again, this is the importance of having independent researchers trying to understand what is going on. The other question that you asked is about how can society learn or know how good is the transparency policies. I think that we should not talk about only the transparency policy, but we need to involve bodies that will control those transparency, the behavior of the platforms regarding transparency. I think that one good suggestion of this bill for transparency in Brazil is that the self-regulation rules should be presented to a governance body that is a multi-stakeholder governance body, which is the Internet Steering Committee. And then that specific body will analyze the performance of those rules. Again, there are many interesting suggestions. For instance, we can use an approach called service level agreement to see if the companies are presenting a good service level in terms of content moderation, transparency. So there are many aspects of this topic, transparency, that should be put in a larger context that is governance. And I think that this event today is a very relevant event and it's very timely, because we need to have this discussion among the Latin American countries about governance. We need to share our experience and rules so that we can improve governance mechanism for our region. So I would like to congratulate the organizers of this event, because it's timely and very relevant.
Thank you very much. Marina.
Bueno, algo que creo que es fundamental.
Something that is essential and that is in the proposals is the right for auditing, the right to auditing. Auditing can offer us not access to codes, but maybe answers regarding the impacts. What are the results of the algorithms? This is a very interesting mechanism that should be explored further, because it helps us to answer the concerns, to respond to the concerns on privacy and data, and privacy of data. And another related issue that has to do with auditing, the creation of systems so that researchers can research in the platforms, so access to data. The promotion of access to researchers should be accompanied not only by the companies themselves, as it is today, but also by governments and organizations of civil society and academia, so that we can promote the minimization of the risk that these platforms select only partners or researchers that are committed to them in some sense, even financially. When I was mentioning auditing and access to researchers, the bottom line, what I am speaking about in terms of governments, is that different data should be made available to publics of different abilities. So maybe what can a Brazilian person do with an access to codes and algorithms? Nothing. It's important that we should understand to define what kinds of data, because otherwise this is going to give us a feeling that transparency is not good at all. Because if a lot of data is offered to citizens and they can do nothing at all with it, it will not result in a greater protection to society. Also, I believe that a very relevant transparency mechanism, which is easier to guarantee, is for companies to offer information on which were the most popular contents by country and by day. And this is important for a Brazil debate that is being carried out in Brazil on Okay, it's a debate on access by people, whether people are part of a group or not. So Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil have a group and they exchange information. It would be extremely helpful to make the debate public, to make this information accessible to all, even outside these little groups selected by the large companies, to be able to discuss widely in society and create a condition, a level, a baseline for debate, so that we know where we are, because it's impossible to know what's going on with one group or another. This is very simple. Facebook does it. It has a strategy in this sense, apparently, and it even stopped publishing the most shared groups because one of them was dealt with misinformation on health. So access is one point. Lastly, maybe we have this debate a lot in Brazil. Maybe we can make a difference between the difference in obligations for advertising, which is a paid content. This could be included in the data banks in a wider way that we can all access. And we could even have information on who is paying and a greater possibility of selection and of researching. Thank you very much. We are reaching the end of our session. I would like to thank Olívia, Nighat, Virgilio, and Marina for their presentations. The selection of the panel members has a lot to do with the involvement of their organizations in a process which has not begun now but needs a great deal more development, and which deals with the fact that service providers, platforms, have obligations not because we thought about them, the ones that are working on these issues. Rather, their obligations arise from United Nations-based human rights matters, which have been discussed in different panels and by different people who are here. Not all the regulatory mechanisms are the same as regards platforms. Latin America has big differences with the United States, but it is working in a different sense. So is Asia. The African countries are also taking this process forward, and it takes a great deal of debate in society because platforms and this type of services have a global outreach. What we demand is that there are standards of human rights with equality for all persons. So thanks for being part of this panel. One request is to please look at the documents of the forum, which are promoted by Reporters Sans Frontières, by many organizations and countries. Not only does it deal with transparency, which was the reason for this panel, as Virgilio said, this is much more wider reaching, but it's a substantial element for the strengthening of democracy and human rights. Today is the Freedom of Press Day, so thank you very much.